chairs.
Hell yeah. Got Hobbs on your right playing that Esper Superheroes deck that's been relatively popular lately. Dylan Hand playing that mass manipulation deck. It's going to be important for Dylan to get off the ground here with a ramp spell, and he has one here with Paradise Druid.
Yep, and we'll see what Jonathan Hobbs can do about that. Now, that creature, of course, has hexproof as long as it's untapped. Hobbs also has his ideal turn 2 play, though. There's Hero Precinct 1.
Yeah, but this is not the matchup where Hero Precinct 1 is good. And here you're going to see Dylan Hand bounce it with a Teferi Time Raveler, one of the thorns in Standard side at the moment. I know this is getting a lot of people into Reflector Mage vibes.
And follow-up, also going to use that Paradise Druid to cast the Llanowar Elves, so definitely doing what the deck does here. A lot of mana production, has a Planeswalker on the table. Things looking good for Hand so far.
Yeah, this is an ideal start. Multiple mana creatures and a Planeswalker on turn 3. Hobbs here are going to need a lot of help to get back in this game, and it's only turn 3. All he did was play a Hero Precinct 1.
Isolated Chapel's land for turn. Both players doing pretty well on the colored mana front. He has a Teferi Time Reveler of his own in his hand. That's a little awkward.
It is. He can tick up if he so chooses, but it looks like he's going to go ahead and tick down, bounce the Paradise Druid, but that's going to leave his Time Raveler vulnerable to that Llanowar Elves attack.
We pass back to Hand.
Oh, no land from Hand, and that's a good sign for Hobbs because it looks like it's just going to be 1 mana accelerator here and an attack on the opposing Teferi would be my guess. Hand here unable to deploy 2 mana creatures as well as take down that Teferi.
Yeah, so bouncing the mana creature kind of working out for Hobbs, at least for now. See Hand's Teferi goes up to 2. Llanowar Elves will attack down Hobbs, and that Paradise Druid's redeployed.
Yeah, and here you're just seeing both players kind of trying to jockey for position on the battlefield, using those Teferi Time Ravelers to buy themselves some time until they start to get to the heavy hitters. Hobbs here now able to deploy 2 copies of Hero Precinct 1. At the very least, the tokens generated from those heroes can invalidate those mana creatures from attacking over the next few turns, but that's not really where you want to be in this matchup. You just want to ramp and start playing haymakers as quickly as possible.
Hand has found land number 4. It's an island. He'll play it. Takes his Time Raveler up to 3. Now he has up to 6 mana here.
Yeah, he can deploy a 4/4 Hydro Krasis and draw 2 cards, which I kind of like that play. But it does leave his Teferi potentially vulnerable to a bounce or removal spell, followed by an attack with the 2 heroes. He can also just kind of ramp up with a couple more Incubation Druids. If he so chooses, looks like he's going to go for the latter.
Yep, 2 Incubation Druids. Pass turn. Back to Hobbs. See exactly how many tokens he can make with these heroes. Got to start going to work here.
Now, when I said the Hero Precinct 1 was not super good in the matchup, it's completely different when you have 2 and then now 3 copies, because then every Tyrant Scorn, every removal spell or multicolored spell you play is going to generate 3 tokens, and eventually those start to get out of hand. And Hobbs here is poised to have a really strong turn if he decides to deploy the hero and the Tyrant Scorn that he has.
Well, he does have some options, though. Land number 5 was Glacial Fortress. I believe he has Teferi Hero of Dominaria, which you can make a couple tokens casting that, untap your lands, and also cast Tyrant Scorn.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty strong play. Unfortunately, though, Time Raveler does lock down instant speed plays, so the extra 2 mana from the Teferi Hero of Dominaria is effectively invalidated during the end step. But Hobbs here going to get a bit aggressive here. Going to go after the Teferi, but unfortunately chose not to use the Tyrant Scorn pre-combat, and he's going to miss out on a 1/1 token here.
Yeah, so the attack with both heroes on the Teferi, Paradise Druid trades with 1, but yeah, as you mentioned, can't do anything in the combat step because of that Time Raveler. So post-combat, Tyrant Scorn is going to take down 1 of the Incubation Druids, 2 tokens for Hobbs.
Yeah, and I think that the outcome was going to be effectively the same no matter what Hobbs, or no matter how Hobbs sequenced this turn. I think the Paradise Druid was always going to trade, and he just missed out on a 1/1. And hopefully that won't come back to bite him, but it certainly could eventually.
All right, we'll go back to Hand. Did not draw a land. Looks like Nissa was the pickup. Put his Teferi back to 2.
Get some of the Shaheen Sarani Humans tokens. That is, of course, part of our Well,
personality.
Personality tokens,
Yeah.
yes.
Very fitting to see Shaheen being generated by an Esper deck.
That's true. That's true. You know, when I first saw Hero Precinct 1, I actually assumed that it was going to be much better an aggressive deck with timely reinforcements. But it turns out it's just really good with all multicolor cards.
It's Llanowar Elves and 4 lands. That's going to tap. Hand will cast Nissa, who shakes the world. Untap that island, make it a 3/3. And pass turn.
Give him and importantly, a 3/3 blocker here for those 2/2 Hero Precinct 1s. But if Hobbs has a pair of removal spells here, he can knock off both Planeswalkers.
It's like there's a Basilica Bellhaunt, a Narset in the hand.
Now, Bellhaunt not at his finest in this matchup, but, you know, any spell is fine. Any multicolored spell is actually quite good. I would actually look for Hobbs here to probably play Teferi, then just minus on the Nissa who shakes the world, tucking it and not attacking with anything. He could send a bunch of stuff to kill the Teferi Time Raveler, but the cost would be one of his heroes of Precinct 1. And with a Teferi on 2, it's not really that daunting.
Yeah, so he does cast Teferi, makes 2 more Shaheens, tucks away that Nissa, and we're back on hand's turn. Pluses his Teferi up to 3.
Nowhere else to go but up. Looks like we're going to be making a 4/4 Hydroid Krasis, but I think hand is actually in a bit of a predicament here. As long as Hobbs is able to clear this Krasis, he's going to be able to knock off the Time Raveler and start chipping in a bunch of damage on Dylan. And even something like Mass Manipulation is not that great when you're facing down an army of 1/1s.
Yeah, once the heroes have made a bunch of tokens, when Hobbs gets his Planeswalkers established, you know, the Mass Manipulation can turn some things around, but hand's trouble in this game has been his mana development. He can't manipulation for too much.
Yeah, and that's mostly because Hobbs has been pressuring those mana creatures with the minus on Time Raveler as well as Tyrant Scorn. But a miss, a rare miss from a Narset Harder of Veils here, leaves Hobbs wishing he had maybe filled his deck with a few more instants and sorceries. Or just non-land permanents.
Yeah, 26 lands and 8 creatures in the deck.
All right, 4 tokens here, going to come at Time Raveler. Crate's going to eat 1. Teferi's going to go down. And then Hobbs gets to untap 2 lands during the end step and potentially cast an instant now that Time Raveler is gone.
Yeah, that swing definitely beneficial for him.
This matchup super grindy. Both decks able to play Magic for quite a long time. Dylan hand with, at the very least, 1 Hydroid Krasis and a Nissa who shakes the world in hand. Facing off a Narset Parterville, a Teferi Hero Dominaria already on the battlefield, as well as that pair of Hero Precinct 1 that are kind of gumming up the ground.
All right, so Godless Shrines to land. Hobbs will untap 2 lands from that Teferi activation earlier in the turn. We'll go to hand side of things. Looks like he has another Time Raveler in his hand.
Yeah, his hand's pretty stacked. He's been a little short on mana, and it's funny to say that because he's had 5, 6, 7 mana like every turn for the last 4 turns. But you know, he keeps getting those mana creatures popped via removal or bounce, and you know, kind of wants to save the Hydro Krasis until he has just an exorbitant amount. The Nissa who shakes the world got stifled a bit on the mana generation front earlier.
Yeah, it's just a very mana-hungry deck. It's kind of funny, 7 mana here, but in a lot of situations, that's still just 1 spell a turn territory for him.
Yeah. Dylan here going to be casting that Nissa who shakes the world most likely. Depending on what else he wants to cast, may untap a forest to generate up to 4 mana this turn.
So there's that Nissa. Looking at Temple Garden, that will be the target. Make that into a 3/3. That now taps for 2, taps the Druid, and there's Teferi Time Raveler. If Hobbs is going to cast a spell on hand's turn, he wants to do it now, but the Raveler is just in. It'll bounce one of the heroes.
Yeah, and this is going to let, well, that's actually a bit unfortunate for Dylan. The Narset locks down that extra draw Hand could have sent the Krasis at the Narset before minusing, so perhaps a small misstep, but also kind of wants to get that Hero Precinct 1 off the battlefield so Hobbs can't double block the 3-3.
Yeah, see, now you see attacks on the Planeswalkers. Hydroid Krasis takes down Teferi Hero of Dominaria. His 3-3 land that was attacking the Narset was actually chump blocked by the remaining hero by Hobbs.
Yeah, and Hand noticing the draw every single turn from the Hero of Dominaria, a bit stronger than the minus on the Narset where Hobbs only has one more available. Hobbs going to need an answer here for that Hydroid Krasis because it's looking to just be a Planeswalker killer, and he has to worry about Dylan untapping with the Nissa Who Shakes the World. Potentially a ton of mana generated on the following turn.
Start by minusing Narset, finds Oath of Kaya. Not enough to deal with that Hydroid Krasis.
No, but it can check the 3-3 untapped land and allow those 3 human tokens to eat the opposing Time Raveler and send some chip damage at the Nissa Who Shakes the World. So it's not bad, but I just don't know if it's enough, and that's kind of the story of this matchup. Both players have a lot of cards that say draw a card on them, add a lot to the battlefield via these creatures that generate value as the game goes on, but the Mass Manipulation deck just has mana ramp and cards that get better when you have a ton of mana.
Hobbs plays Isolated Chapel for turn. Mentioned earlier, he has that Basilica Bellhaunt in hand. That's the wrong black, black, white, white spell. The Kaya's Wrath are in the sideboard.
Yeah, Kaya's Wrath would be okay here, clearing out a lot of these mana creatures, and I assume that it's going to be coming in after sideboard.
So redeploy that hero, cast the Kaya's Wrath, targets the island.
Yeah, and the hero token's going to be knocking off Time Raveler, probably putting 2 on Nissa Who Shakes the World, maybe just 1 and holding back a blocker, though, to protect his own Planeswalker.
Yeah, so you see 1 takes down Teferi, 1 at the Nissa. He has that fresh token and 1 that he held back, as you mentioned. Passes back Hand's way.
Yeah, it's mostly a nod. He wants to try to keep his creatures alive, or keep his Planeswalker alive, because Narset does have a bit of value against things like opposing Hydroid Krasis. We saw the static effect prevent Dylan from drawing a card last turn from the Teferi Time Raveler minus as well.
And we'll see what Hand can do here to apply more pressure. Hand's just been all spells pretty much the entire game. He did miss 1 land drop in the game. Still has a couple haymakers left over and a good amount of mana because of that Nissa.
Yeah, Nissa allows both Temple Garden and the Forest to generate an extra mana, and then he can even untap the Forest, turning into a 3-3, and that's 6 right there, 7-8 from his other 2 lands, 9-10 from his mana creatures. It's a lot.
Just thinking about starting with an attack. If he gets that Narset off the table, he could do something like cast a big Hydroid Krasis and draw some cards.
Right. And Hobbs here recognizing that the lands are pretty important here for Hand's game plan overall, and is constricting his mana a little bit by deploying a double block, even though he's trading out his hero.
All right, so Temple Garden's going to trade with Hero Precinct 1 and 1 of the tokens. Hydroid Krasis coming in. Looks like Narset's down. And I think there's a question about an Oath of Kaya trigger that may have been missed.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty clean-cut mistrigger policy going to be enacted where they're going to give Dylan Hand the option to put it on the stack, and then ultimately Dylan just has the option, right? And it's a tournament play, a lot of money, points, Players' Championship on the line. It's very common to see this type of thing. Just say, okay, you missed your trigger. Let's keep the game going.
Yeah, reasonable to call the judge in the spot, though I don't think this game's going to hinge on that trigger.
It shouldn't, but, you know, things change quickly in some scenarios. And
all right, player's going to plead their case. So they're going to deliberate over this. This stuff's horrible to watch, so we're going to cut away. Nobody needs to see that.
All right, well, let's, what do you want to do? What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about the people in the Players' Championship race? We got a list of accomplishments from, looks like our top 16 players and how they did so far this year on the SCG Tour. We'll start with Alex Hahn in the running here for the Players' Championship.
16th place.
16th place, has 3 Classic top 8s with a win and 1 Regionals top 8. That regional tournament that we had earlier this year playing a pretty big factor in his spot on the leaderboard.
Yeah, definitely. That's a lot of points. Classic win, also good for 15.
Yeah, and I mean, we have multiple players in the top 16 who've gotten basically their bread and butter here on the SCG Tour through Classics, and those are, of course, our Sunday events that we don't televise, but they are still part of the SCG Tour, and they're a great event to play on Sunday if you don't happen to make day 2. So.
Yeah, and when you talk about point conversion, a Classic wins as good as an open top 8.
Right, and went back in the day when I was making a race for the Players' Championship myself, I had plenty of success on the Classics as well as the Opens, and those points add up. And for a number of players, the Classics are pretty important.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about more players later. We're definitely watching that race this weekend, but our judge call has been resolved. We'll go ahead and get you back down to the match here. Sounds like they are putting the trigger on the stack. You see it's resolved. Hobbs has gone up to 23.
Now, I think there's a new policy as far as rules are concerned where basically if nothing has transpired since that really changes any decisions that have been made, I believe that they allow what I like to call takesies, backsies.
I'll leave this stuff to the judge staff.
Right.
Anyway, Dylan Hand's going to win game number 1.
Did it matter? It didn't matter.
Yeah, weird.
Hobbs. Come on, Hobbs. All right, well, that's game 1 going to Dylan Hand. As I expected, the Bant Mass Manipulation deck just goes way over the top in game 1. Hobbs is going to need a bit of help in game 2 if he wants to win the match. He's going to need some things like the Elder Spell to knock off some of those Planeswalkers, maybe Kaya's Wrath to knock off all those mana creatures. But it's rather difficult when you start to look at things like Dovin's Veto, because something like Teferi Time Raveler can completely lock you out of being able to play those reactive spells.
Well, let's go ahead and go card by card. As we've started to do here. Start with Jonathan Hobbs. 2 Nightveil Predator, if you don't recognize that art.
So Nightveil Predator, 4-mana, 3/3, Death Touch, flying, hexproof. It's from the same cycle as Crackling Drake and Basilica Belhaunt. Doesn't see a lot of play, but the fact that it has hexproof is actually quite good against the Planeswalkers. And I think that it might come in here as a way to pressure these opposing Planeswalkers, but at the same time, it's a bit mopey. I'm not sure if it's going to come in.
This one's actually interesting to me. Cry of the Carnarium.
I fully expect Hobbs to side out all of his Hero Precinct 1s and just go hard on the Cry of the Carnariums as well as the Kaya's Wrath. I think that's a 1-2 punch package that he's just going to be trying to sweep up all the mana creatures and turn into a more traditional Esper control deck.
All right, Dovin's Veto and Duress.
If you go that route, the Planeswalkers are fairly problematic, so I think I would probably bring in both, even though Dovin's Veto could end up being a brick in the face of a Time Raveler.
All right, so there's 2 copies of both of those. Also 2 copies of the Elder Spell.
Plenty of Planeswalkers from Dylan's hand, maybe a couple more out of the sideboard. These players do not know each other's lists. He saw Nizu Shakes the World and Teferi Time Raveler in game 1. I expect them to come in.
All right, Kaya's Wrath, 3 copies.
Yep, just all removal all the time. You want to make sure you sweep up the mana creatures and you pop off the Planeswalkers. And I believe just the discard, the counter spells, and the sweepers are what you want.
And 3 Lyra Dawnbringer.
Mostly an anti-mono red and an anti-Gruul card. Lyra Dawnbringer definitely not going to come in this matchup.
Right, so Hand's got some options over on his side. Let's start with 3 Thorn Lieutenant.
I don't mind it. It is quite good against Teferi Time Raveler specifically, but I think that card is mostly there to help fend off the mono-red aggressive decks, because even if they kill it with a removal spell, you get a 1/1 that can block Bashano Pyromancer as well as Fanatical Firebrand. It is a way for Dylan to get aggressive if he so chooses. It also dodges Cry of the Carnarium, which I like. So I wouldn't mind it, but I don't think that he's going to bring him in, but I think it is a fine card to have in this particular matchup.
4 Thrashing Brontodon.
Not a whole lot of enchantments running around from the Esper Superheroes deck. I don't think it's going to come in, but if he wants to go low to the ground, beat down plan, it might run headfirst into Kaya's Wrath, but if that's what he wants to do, it's what he wants to do.
4 Negate.
I do like those coming in because I will expect my superhero's opponent to go a lot larger after sideboard and a lot more controlling. And even in the face of Teferi Time Raveler, I do think Negate is quite good here.
Some larger creatures, 2 Lyra Dawnbringer and a Tolsimer Friend of Wolves.
Again, these are not cards you really want against a Esper Superheroes deck. I'd much rather have those against Mono Red or decks of Pressure, Life Total. Don't think I want either of those.
Right. River's Rebuke.
Don't love it. I think people will make the mistake of bringing it in because you saw in Game 1 so many tokens were generated from the Esper Superheroes deck side of things. But for the most part, a card like River's Rebuke is going to be more for the Command the Dreadhorde decks that deploy a bunch of Planeswalkers and creatures.
All right. So for those of you that keep up on the lore of the game, War of the Spark was a pretty big set for storytelling.
Or like Lore of the Spark.
Kithian. I don't remember Kithian's real last name. I don't think any part of Gideon Jura is actually his name. But anyway, there's a signature spellbook dedicated to Gideon coming out that you can pre-order. Some new alternate art cards in there, new card frame for them as well, similar to the old signature spellbook Jace that you'd seen. So you got the full card list there, including Rest in Peace. It's a pretty big modern card.
Yeah, and they actually previewed a lot of these cards when they were going over the War of the Spark story, and one of which when Gideon sacrificed his life for Liliana, the Rest in Peace was just a memorial to him. It was a beautiful piece of artwork and a great way to tell Gideon's story and his final days.
Yeah, so you can pre-order that. Ships June 28th. It's at go.starcitygames.com/SS2, signature spellbook, of course. The highlight for me is the new Blackblade Reforge, art by Richard Kane Ferguson.
Sure, yeah.
He was the artist for the original Blackblade for Dakin Blackblade.
Dakin Blackblade.
And then later Corlash Airlow Blackblade. He did the art for all of these, and so it's a callback to that.
That's awesome.
His art is really cool stuff.
Looks like both players are ready to go here for Game 2. Dillingham going to lead off with a Llanowar Elves, but a Thought Eraser from Hobbs could take away the only meaty part of Dillinham's hand.
Yeah, sees a hand of 2 Llanowar Elves, a Hydroid Krasis, and 2 Entrancing Melodies.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the melodies here in Dylan's deck. I would have expected him to get those out, but at the same time, he might not have enough things to cut. But here, the Krasis is the pretty obvious pick.
Take is the Krasis. D-Spark will be surveilled over. Will go Hand's way. Notably, Hobbs leading on 2 blue-black lands. No white mana shown just yet.
Yeah, and here I think Hand's just going to deploy a couple more mana creatures, and he drew a Hydra Krasis, which was a great draw. But if Hobbs has the Cry of the Carnarium here, things could go real bad for Hand.
Yeah, this is a big check for that. He might get hit by the old Thoughtseize bug. Another Thought Erasure, though. That's a good one. Krasis down once again.
Right, but again, I don't think Hobbs actually has a land drop here. He bent a D-Spark, which is pretty decent in the matchup. Okay, I take it back. Doesn't have white mana.
Yes, Watery Grave will be the 3rd land, and Hand's just going to attack with those 3 Llanowar Elves. So Hobbs to 16 at the end of that.
2 Entrancing Melody in hand, though, for Dylan, so effectively dead cards here. I expect Hobbs has very few creatures in his deck at the moment. Going to go ahead and deploy a Narset Parter of Veils, which notably can't find white mana.
That is a problem, as he's going to find a Dovin's Veto.
That's not the best at the moment, but could potentially play a role later in the game.
And another blue-black land, Watery Grave go. Handle attack down the Narset, and there's the 4th Llanowar Elves.
Game.
4 of a kind, what do you got?
Well, I got a Teferi here, Dominaria off this white source here. We're going to draw a card, tick up, dig for another white source, and try to play Kaya's Wrath in a turn or 2.
So Glacial Fortress Go was the play from Hobbs.
Yeah, that's fair. I actually quite like going Teferi, hold up Dovin's Veto with that 2 mana, and dig for that potential second white to play the Kaya's Wrath, because if you strip Hand of those 4 mana creatures, that's kind of like playing 4 Stone Rains.
So Hand found a 4th land, played that past. Hand is just 2 Entrancing Melodies. Llanowar Elves just keep coming across. This attack will put him down to 8, and he's just been passing the turn. Is that the second white source? Ooh, Isolated Chapel. I want to say he has Kaya's Wrath.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he has Kaya's Wrath in hand here, but he can't hold up Dovin's Veto anymore if he does. But I think that that's okay. You check so many of these threats here.
And he's actually thinking about Oath of Kaya, leave up Dovin's Veto.
And it's possible I could have misread his hand, but I feel like he should have deployed this last turn. He's falling pretty far behind against these elves.
Yeah, so that was with the Kaya. Went to 11. He'll go right back down to 8 off of this attack.
Yeah, but he does know that Dylan Hand just has those 2 Entrancing Melodies as his only spells.
All right, Glacial Fortress. That's the 3rd white source. Now we see Kaya's Wrath. Yeah, must have just been leaving up that Dovin's Veto.
I mean, that's fair. One of the only cards that he's really afraid of here is a Nissa Who Shakes the World. I mean, he could have even afforded to take a bit more beats from those Llanowar Elves before actually dying.
And now here's Nightveil Predator. Can't Entrancing Melody that one.
No, you can't, and I am actually just expecting this to do 21 points of damage by itself.
That's sure looking like it. It's very Time Raveler will join the party. Bounce my Oath to Kaya. Draw a card.
3 less, because those the Kaya can go face.
Oh, and Narset Parter of Veils. Takes that down to 3. Takes a look at 4 cards.
Command the Dreadhorde's defined here, and you're saying basically just Dylan Hand flood out, and Hobbs actually just having the right answers at all points. And now that he found his white mana, was able to eventually take over the game. And while Hand had a great start, a couple copies of Thought Erasure just knocked off both Hydroid Krasis and completely invalidated all of the mana ramping he did. And that's exactly what Hobbs needs to do if he wants to win the match and take down Game 3.
Things all tied up here. Now, what I want to talk about in that game, both players knew what Dylan was holding. The Thought Erasure saw that Hand just had Entrancing Melodies, and then Hand saw that Nightveil Predator. That was the only creature that Hobbs cast.
Yep.
You got to figure, for Hobbs, he's aware of mass manipulation, maybe not necessarily Entrancing Melody, but likely is moving off Hero Precincts 1. My assumption is that these cards that Hand is boarding out are things that target creatures, stuff like that, those Entrancing Melodies.
Yeah, and it's possible he just didn't have enough cards to side in, and I think we're going to see a pretty big shift here from Hand. I would not be surprised if all 4 negates came in, maybe some other creatures, maybe some more mana ramp creatures that he sided out, and he's just going to get all those Entrancing Melodies out and just going to try to play some mana ramp and then eventually play a Planeswalker with negate backup and seal the deal.
Now here's where it gets a little bit fun. Now, Hobbs can see all these cards being shifted around. Do you think there's an incentive for him to maybe reach for the Hero Precinct ones and bring them back in?
There is some amount of incentive, but at the same time, I think they're so bad in the matchup. One Hero Precinct 1 is going to have very little effect on the game. We saw in Game 1, he drew 3 of them. And at times, they had a reasonable effect on the game, but almost all just doing the last 1 point of damage to a Time Raveler, double blocking on a 3/3 land from a Nissa Who Shakes the World. That's not really how you're going to get ahead in this matchup. And I would much rather, from Hobbs' side, have things like Kaya's Wrath and Cry of the Carnarium to sweep up all those mana creatures and really expunge the ramping effects from the mass manipulation deck because they're so reliant on those mana creatures.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. That Kaya's Wrath, taking care of those Llanowar Elves, really shut the door in game number 2 there. Things like Cry of the Carnarium could have been huge. In Game 1, Hand went very wide with a lot of non-land mana sources.
Right, and we saw in Game 2, he kind of did the same thing. He had lands as well, but drew all 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, and his 2 big payoff cards that he drew, the 2 Hydro Krasis, both got stripped away. And that's a very common thing to happen against these Esper control decks we've seen in the past. But the Superheroes deck, relying on Hero Precinct 1 and being a bit more mid-rangey at times, often leads them to kind of floundering in Game 1 and being behind an overall power level because they're just not generating nearly enough mana to keep up. But after Sideboard, you get a bunch of ways to punish the mass manipulation deck. Discard spells to take their key cards. Sweeper effects to knock off their mana production. And ultimately, I think after Sideboard, that's where Superheroes deck has a significant advantage.
You see that 18 next to Jonathan Hobbs' name. He's number 18 on our seasonal leaderboard. I guess it's the full year leaderboard. Yeah. So if he is going to be joining the Players' Championship from this season, it's going to mean winning the tournament. Yeah. We have seen him have multiple second-place finishes on the tournament, on the tour. No closes just yet, no trophies. Recently, he did win an MCQ, though.
Nice. That's pretty impressive. Hobbs, a great player. I was a huge fan of his Bant Flash deck from early this year where he took second place, I believe, the first tournament of the year in Richmond, the Standard Open that we had. It was also the first Standard Open we've had in over a year. So I was very excited to have Standard back on the tour in full force as opposed to just being kind of an offhand format in our Team Trio events.
And we see him play a lot of these Esper decks, and he definitely does it well. Very calm player. Players underway game number 3. Breeding Pool tap for Hand versus Hollowed Fountain. And turn 2 with Thorn Lieutenant. Can't cry the Canarium that one.
Can't. Cannot. Man, I just want to point out I called it. Straight up. 100%. That's why they pay me the medium buck.
And the follow-up for hand, Teferi Time Raveler. Just going to put that up to 5. We'll go back to Hobbs.
Yeah, I think it's important to use your mana efficiently in these spots. He could have played the Paradise Druid and gotten 2 more power on the battlefield, but I think that in this spot, just getting the Time Raveler on the battlefield when Hobbs can't, cast Dovin's Veto on it in response is pretty big. And now any creature that Hobbs wants to play is going to get invalidated effectively.
And it's going to be a Teferi Time Raveler Mirror. This time, Hobbs' mana is cooperating so far.
Yeah, that's fair. Hand also has a couple of things to do with his mana. Has a Paradise Druid he can ramp with, but that might run him straight into Kaya's Wrath next turn, so he's got to be a bit careful of that.
Let's see exactly how he wants to navigate this. Sometimes you see players -3 to Teferi just to draw a card.
Yeah, it does say up to 1 creature, so you can just minus to draw a card.
And that's what he's going to do. We're going to check on that die. That should be a 2, and there we put it there. Thorn Lieutenant will attack Hobbs Teferi, Paradise Druid, and thinking about which land he wants to play. Shock for Temple Garden goes to 18.
Bold move considering there's a Teferi Time Raveler on the opponent's battlefield. But if Hobbs wants to minus the Time Raveler to bounce the Thorn Lieutenant, that will potentially give Dylan the option of casting an instant, and shocking his life total is not that relevant, so it's possible that shock could send a signal to Hobbs that hand has something like Dovin's Veto, and he might end up playing around it for the rest of the game, whereas hand doesn't have it currently, you know.
Yeah.
So playing some mind games.
I do enjoy that, and we were talking about kind of a trivial Oath of Kaya trigger earlier. Very unlikely that this game for hand hinges around that 2 life.
Right.
Land number 4 for Hobbs, Isolated Chapel. So he has black, white online.
Yeah, but even though he has the Teferi Time Raveler, so does Dylan. So they're both playing at sorcery speed, and now it just depends on whether or not he has the Kaya's Wrath. And if he does, how does he want to play it? Right now, or do you want to sandbag it? Do you play another Planeswalker, or do you just go ahead and clean up these 2 creatures?
So he's going to cast Kaya's Wrath. Presumably put Teferi to 4.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you forget a lot of things happen, but he's going to go ahead and just cycle this Planeswalker. That's huge.
Yeah, just draws a card, puts it in the bin, passes to hand.
I guess he just really wants to make sure that he gets a card draw out of it, because maybe he was a little light on either mana or action, and there's a chance that maybe even hand does something bad to it. So, I don't know.
And the next turn, Teferi Hero of Dominaria. That's met by negate. Couldn't have done that if he still had the other Teferi.
It's true. That's true. And if he had just ticked up to 4, he could potentially drawn a card on the following turn and not have that Hero of Dominaria negated.
Here's Narset Parter of Veils. That one will resolve for Hobbs. Hand was just making land drops. Looks like Hobbs has some options in the top 4 off the Narset.
Command the Dreadhorde is a reason to put the Teferi back into the graveyard, though, and he does find it off the Narset and has the requisite 6 mana for it next turn. So that Command the Dreadhorde could be a huge deal. Dylan Hand does have access to mass manipulation, but he doesn't have a ton of mana to work with right now.
Yeah, just played his 7th mana source. So 1 more means it's a double confiscate.
Dylan considering a tick down, but that would look pretty foolish in the face of an opposing Narset Parter of Veils. Decides to just go ahead and tick up.
Yeah, plays Paradise Druid. Puts Teferi to 5, passes the turn. So that's the 8th mana source.
Yeah, so if there's steal 2 things.
Yep, if there's 2 targets for the manipulation, he can take them.
Now, I assume Hobbs here, if he commands the Dreadhorde and gets back Time Raveler, Hero of Dominaria, and Thorn Lieutenant, it's going to give him quite the battlefield. But 2 of those likely going to be stolen and added to Dylan Hand's side of things on the following turn. So it's possible Hobbs wants to wait just a little bit longer, maybe even get a little more value out of the Command of the Dreadhorde, or potentially just play around a negate. He already saw 1, and Dylan Hand just kind of been sitting on a few cards over the last few turns, maybe assumes that there's just another negate lying around.
First things first, he'll minus his Narset. Take a look at those top 4 for a non-creature, non-land.
Say that first part again.
Pardon?
First things first. I'm the realist. I wanted to just blurt it out, but I wanted to let you finish your thought.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Found a second Narset. Just going to play that. Been the old one, minus that one.
The classic dig through time into dig through time.
Dig for more digs.
Yeah.
Wish for more wishes.
Yeah. The classic genie trope.
Finds a Teferi Time Raveler.
Here Hobbs is just flush. His hand is just stacked. Doesn't really need to do much of anything because hand isn't really putting pressure on him. Has the Command the Dreadhorde, possibly just looking for a duress or something of that nature before casting the Command of the Dreadhorde because he doesn't want to get blown out.
So Hobbs cast a Time Raveler, put it to 5. We're back on the hand side. Amusingly, I think his draw was Hydroid Krasis. So Narset pretty good there.
Yeah, it's possible that hand actually just wants to cast Manipulation here for 2 just to get both of the Planeswalkers on his side because he can also minus on the Narset as well.
Yeah.
He can also Manipulation for just 1. Take the Narset, minus it, look for a negate, and that'll stop the Command of the Dreadhorde potentially. But he's still looking down opposing Teferi Time Raveler, so I don't know.
Right, yeah, you'd have to do something about the Teferi, so might be priced into doing it for 2.
Yeah.
Could just make a big Krasis as a beater. Probably not good enough.
Probably not good enough. Well, considering Time Raveler sitting on the opponent's side of the battlefield, one giant guy doesn't really do much, especially when it doesn't draw any extra cards because of the Narset.
Yes. And the life gain, not really a factor here.
Yeah,
and
so I would actually expect hand to do this here because the Krasis doesn't really do much of anything. And obviously the Time Raveler can only have 1 on each side of the battlefield. So, and a rare miss again from that Narset. And that's brutal for hand.
Yeah, so Narset to 1. Those are all going to go on the bottom. Still has a Time Raveler activation.
Yeah, wouldn't be surprised to see a minus.
Yep, just draws a card there. And passes turn.
That was a brutal miss from hand on the Narset. And now staring down a Command the Dreadhorde for Hero of Dominaria, a Narset, a Time Raveler, and a Thorn Lieutenant. How much is that? 6, 11,
10?
13 puts you to 5 if you do it. It's pretty dangerous, but leaves you with a lot of Planeswalkers. Doesn't have to get the Lieutenant if he doesn't want to as well. Also got to be careful on Command the Dreadhorde on creatures because an opposing Time Raveler can send it back to your opponent's hand.
Yes, yeah, that is an issue. Notably, hands ticking down did put his current Raveler out of range for that. Could take the Paradise Druid. He's taking everything. Thorn Lieutenant, Paradise Druid, both Teferis and a Narset.
That's going to put him down to 3 life, but if I'm not mistaken, he actually has a Kaya's or Oath of Kaya in hand, so next turn could potentially Oath of Kaya and then Teferi Time Raveler minus on it. So really powerful follow-up here, even though this Command of the Dreadhorde was nuts.
See where he wants to go here. If he wants to draw any cards off these Teferis, he first has to solve the Narset.
Yeah, first is going to, looks like minus on the opposing Narset.
Put that in his deck, third from the top. Guarantees a hit with the Narset.
That's true. Another dig through time and a dig through time.
Looking at the top 4, we know that the floor is that he finds a backup Narset here. Find something else, though. Thought Erasure.
If I'm not mistaken, Hobbs has not played a land this turn either, so if he has a land to play, can still cast the Thought Erasure.
Yep.
Unfortunately, could not use the mana from the end of turn to cast it with the Time Raveler because an opposing Raveler makes that a little more difficult.
Yeah, but he shocks for Thought Erasure. There goes that Hydroid Krasis. Hand left with just Hollowed Fountain in hand. Surveil 1, looks like Hobbs kept that one on top.
Now, I'm not mistaken, that's probably going to put Hobbs down to 1, but we're going to get confirmation from the judges here and make sure.
Yep, there you see it. He is at 1. Hollowed Fountain passed for hand. Puts his Time Raveler to 3, but just has to pass back.
Yeah, I mean, he's out of gas. Got that last Hydrocrisis stripped. Already burned the mass manipulation, and here Hobbs just untapping with 3 Planeswalkers. I cannot imagine that he's not going to bury Dylan in a very short period of time.
Looking real good for Hobbs. Hero Dominaria up to 2, draws a card. Narset down to 1. Looks at those top 4. Ooh. Finds the Elder Spell.
Yeah, and he could potentially send Hero Dominaria up a bunch of loyalty this turn.
Yep, destroys the Time Raveler, puts the Hero Dominaria up to 4. Still has a Time Raveler activation.
He also has a Dovin's Veto in hand, so this is really bad for Dylan.
At this point, I'm not sure anything gets him out of it.
I mean, mass manipulation steal can potentially steal a bunch of stuff. He'd have to hit like runner, something to potentially bait out the Dovin's Veto, and then mass manipulation on the following turn. It's going to be very tough.
Night Veil Predator deployed for Hobbs, and we'll go back Hand's way.
I think he drew a mass manipulation, but he's about to have a rude awakening.
Yeah, I mean, that draw step's where it starts. It's not going to do anything but get the Dovin's Veto out of hand.
Yep. I mean, this is like literally the perfect draw, but unfortunately for Dylan, the Dovin's Veto from Hobbs here is going to shut it down.
Head in his hands.
Classic. Classic drew the perfects.
What shall I do? Cast my mass manipulation or not cast my mass manipulation?
I mean, it's tricky. He only gets to take 3 permanents, right? So he can take Hero of Dominaria. I think that one's a sure thing. And then he has to consider if he wants to target his own Thorn Lieutenant or either of the other 2 Planeswalkers, but it doesn't really matter. He's tapping 1 too much mana, if I'm not mistaken. Can only do it for 3, so he's definitely targeting Hero. But it doesn't matter. We're going to get countered, and that's
he'll
a GG.
concede. And there you see Jonathan Hobbs 2-1 over Dylan Hand. The Esper deck really malleable post sideboard.